America was not the first country to try and force a government onto Iraq to keep the oil flowing. In the early 20th century, Britain tried to do the same thing and ran into many of the same problems. How did Britain control Mandatory Iraq, and why did it eventually fall apart? On this episode of Intrigued Mind, we'll be looking into the history of the British Mandate in Iraq. If you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creators of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. The Kingdom of Iraq, under British administration, better known as Mandatory Iraq, was created in 1921. It was called Mandatory because it was created by mandate. It's a fitting name since it was essentially the British government saying it's now mandatory that all of you people be in a country together because we said so. Faisal ibn Hussein, who had been made king of Syria by a Syrian National Congress in 1920, was kicked off his throne by the French that same year. But, luckily for him, a different colonial power decided that they liked him. The British gave him the territory of Iraq to rule over as a kingdom. The British Royal Air Force helped maintain military control, and Britain ruled the territory, even though he was on the throne. The biggest problem they faced in maintaining order was the fact that a lot of Iraqi nationalists didn't want them there and continued to violently resist. The British administration also had particular trouble trying to establish control in Iraqi Kurdistan. There were a few secret anti-colonial societies that were lurking beneath the surface, waiting to overthrow the British. There was the League of the Islamic Awakening, the Muslim National League, and the Guardians of Independence. They all had the same general goal, but were separated by various ideological differences. Imam Shirazi and his son Mirza Muhammad Riza were the ones to organize the biggest insurgent effort. Shirazi issued a fatwa, or religious ruling, stating that it was against Islamic law for Muslims to be ruled by non-Muslims like the British. He called for a jihad against their colonial oppressors. Iraq was thrown into chaos and was essentially in a state of anarchy for 3 months, where nobody was really in control. The British were only able to restore order by bringing in reinforcements from India to put down the rebellion. The jihad failed to unite enough people to get rid of the British. This revolt, although unsuccessful, was a major event in contemporary Iraqi history. For the first time ever, Sunni and Shia, rural people and urbanites, were all brought together in a common goal. The integration of these groups into one society, along with the resolution of certain very old conflicts, is what made the formation of modern Iraq possible. The British made heavy use of the Royal Air Force in order to put down any possible threats to the monarchy they had set up. Maintaining control of the skies was considered by the British to be the most cost-effective method of controlling the territory. Since their enemies really had no good way of dealing with planes, they could essentially bomb them with impunity. Land forces were of secondary importance. During the 1920s and 30s, the Royal Air Force blew up all kinds of protests and revolts so that British rule could be maintained. When a Kurdish leader, Sheikh Mahmud, launched a rebellion, at first, the British tried to fight him off with the newly created Iraqi army. This failed, and so they had to go back to the Royal Air Force. Rebellions by Shia groups in the south were dealt with in the same way. The British picked Faisal to be their figurehead because they thought he had enough nationalist and Islamic credentials to have broad appeal. But he was also vulnerable enough to stay dependent on them for support. He was also a 38th generation direct descendant of Muhammad, which they knew would give him instant approval from some people. His ancestors had held political authority in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina since the 10th century. The British thought that all this meant that Faisal would satisfy all of the traditional Arab standards of political legitimacy. Faisal had also played a role in the 1916 Arab revolt against the Turks, so they thought that even nationalist rebels would like him for that. He was a fellow revolutionist after all. That was what the British hoped anyway. He was played by Alec Guinness in the iconic film Lawrence of Arabia. At the Cairo Conference of 1922, Faisal was under a lot of pressure from nationalists and anti-British rebels. They wanted Faisal to limit British influence in the region and take back more real power. Faisal knew that ultimately his monarchy could only exist with British support. He tried to appease the rebels and the British at the same time by taking a moderate approach to dealing with the colonialists. In Cairo, a treaty was ratified that stated that Faisal would have to follow British advice on anything affecting British interests, including fiscal policy. British officials would also be appointed to specified posts in 18 different departments. Iraq would have to pay half the cost of supporting all of these resident British officials, among other things. The new obligations for the British under this treaty were really just about maintaining order. For instance, they would have to provide military assistance if someone were to attack Iraq. They would also have to propose Iraq for membership in the League of Nations, which they would later join. Faisal was unable to prevent the treaty and felt as though the British had gone back on promises they had made to him. The British also decided to create an indigenous Iraqi army at this conference, which proved to be significant. In Iraq, like in many parts of the so-called developing world, the military was the best organized institution in the country. The rest of the political system was quite weak. This meant that while Iraq's ruling structure fell apart during the mandatory period, the military's power only increased. It was the only thing that could handle the turbulent times. The officers in this army were Sunnis who had previously served under the Ottomans, and the lower ranks were filled with Shia tribal elements. As Mandatory Iraq continued, tribal sheiks, wealthy urban families, and Ottoman-trained army officers all vied for positions of power. Iraq's newly established political institutions were the creation of Britain. The concept of a democratic government simply had no precedent in the history of the region. It was just something that had been foisted upon them by the British. The politicians in Baghdad, Faisal included, lacked legitimacy in the eyes of the people they were supposedly ruling. They never developed real constituencies who felt they were being represented by them. So despite the fact that Iraq eventually got a constitution and an elected assembly, it didn't really ever look like a Western democracy. It was more like a system of shifting alliances between important people and cliques. In 1936 and 37, fresh protests broke out against the government. They were mainly motivated by agrarian issues and the fact that the British were drafting people into the military. With the help of the Royal Air Force, the Iraqi government suppressed these protests with indiscriminate killing. Bombings weren't exactly surgically precise, and many people unrelated to the protests were killed. Many Shia religious leaders were kicked out of Iraq during this period because they were Persians. Some modern historians have looked back on Mandatory Iraq in a more positive light, despite the violent repression and bombings. It's been described by some as an agent of modernization and as a sort of beneficial colonialism. Others disagree and point out that Iraq really didn't progress economically at all under British rule. In fact, Iraq's most important economic sector at the time, agriculture, actually got worse. Iraq became less productive and yielded less food per acre under British rule. Mandatory Iraq created a new ruling class for the region. The British picked men who were without power or influence and would suddenly promote them to high places in the government. They could make people powerful and rich at will. These very new rulers were completely inexperienced and in fact had no idea what they were doing. This meant they were totally reliant upon the British civil administration for their position. If they didn't cooperate, the British could just go find someone else who would. The supposedly democratic electoral system really worked much differently than advertised. The government's provincial rulers were really election agents who would create lists of the people they wanted elected and then would get them elected. It was just another weapon in the hands of the British, with which they could better control the country they had more or less conjured up out of thin air. The biggest reason Britain wanted to hang on to Iraq for as long as possible wasn't because they had fun bombing people. It was because of oil. In the early 20th century, it was rapidly becoming clear to the major industrial powers that oil was going to be an important resource moving forward. Prior to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the British-controlled Turkish Petroleum Company held most of the rights to oil. Had the British not come up with another way of moving in, the French would have been the ones to get most of the oil. Britain and Iraq had many heated negotiations about what exactly would happen with the oil. Iraq insisted on getting 20% equity participation. This is what the old agreement with the Ottomans had been. Iraqi nationalists weren't satisfied with this tiny concession and wanted more, but the Iraqi negotiations ultimately accepted their fifth of the oil money. Unfortunately for them, they ended up not even getting that. In 1925, the newly formed Iraq Petroleum Company was given complete and total control over the oil for a period of 75 years. The Iraq Petroleum Company was, ironically, owned by the British. Understanding more about the complicated origins of Iraq can help to explain its current situation. Countries like the United States, who are interested in continuing the long tradition of meddling in their affairs, would do well to look back on how past attempts to stabilize the area have gone. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.